So what I'm going to present to you today is sort of a summary of the things that I've been trying to learn for the past 12 years. So when I first, 2005 is when I finished my degree, and I decided I wanted to study regional development. I was still in Portugal at the time. And I wanted to study regional, not development, because I wanted to be close to people, to go to cities and to local areas and try to understand what was happening there that made some areas get richer and others remain poor. And also because I like this idea of innovation and knowledge. Okay? This was, I hadn't really studied very much what it meant. It was more, I just liked, it seemed to me that it was the most correct thing to do, right? If you want a good country, not just economically, but good citizens, active social, cultural, political life, you need knowledge. People need to be capable of learning, of thinking, and also innovating, especially if you see innovation as a general attitude towards finding solutions. Now, when I then arrived in the UK, where I went to do my master's, I realized that the theories that existed about innovation, specifically for regional development, didn't really seem very appropriate to me, at least not to the experience of the Portuguese case. And I never understood very well, and I think now, that's why I say 12 years later, I think I'm starting to understand what the problem was. And some of the problem has just to do with the fact that these theories, or these, and also the policies that come out of it, were built based on examples from rich countries. From, I don't know what are your areas, but maybe you have heard about places like Silicon Valley. It's a place in California where a lot of the high-tech companies are located. Google, Facebook, Apple. It's supposed to be a very unique place. You go there and you have a good idea, and immediately you get rich and start a new company. But there's other examples around the world, and I felt that a lot of these ideas had influenced these theories too much. Okay, so I'm going to start by summarizing what is this current thinking, or what are these policies, and it will be a very simple introduction. And then I will go and start one by one, or I will break it into 3 points, and I will try to explain why they are not very good and how you have to change them, and how this helps us understand the experience of peripheral regions, what I call peripheral regions. Now the thing is also, because of the crisis, the problem of, before the crisis was, I think a lot of the discourse was primarily about how you had the capital region in each country, even in countries like Portugal, Spain, Greece, Italy, they tended to be converging with the European Union. And it's true that if you look at GDP, right, at wealth, it's true that a lot of these regions did go towards the European average and even above the European average. And so a lot of people said, oh, the problem now is no longer the country, it's more the poor regions in the country. But I think that with the crisis, even if some of these capital regions remain very rich, people start to understand, well, there's a bit more structural problems here across the European Union. Okay, so it's a bit more complicated. And I think some of these things now are relevant not just for regions, but also for countries. Okay, so first of all, this is one of the major, I think, problems of these models. They say that underdevelopment, or less developed regions, are less developed primarily because of characteristics of those regions, internal to the region, right? Usually called endogenous issues. They say, okay, you have people, you have some physical resources, you have some financial resources, you have some technologies, and they are not doing well. They're not performing to the level that they should be performing, and that's why you're not as rich as the other regions, right? This is one of the, the first point. And actually, in 2009, there was a big report called the Marques report, because it was written by an Italian guy called Marques. And he was talking about cohesion policy and the European Union funds to develop the regions, right? And he said exactly this. He said, cohesion policy as a distribution policy is not good, because you would have to be much bigger to be a redistribution policy. It's about trying to take some of these resources and make them perform better, right? Make people more productive, make The other side, and this Depends. Some people don't talk about it, but I think nowadays there's more discussions about this. Is you say, okay, so it's primarily about using your resources better, but also creating conditions so that you attract foreign firms, right? You want BMW and Apple and Google to invest in your region, and you do this by making yourself a good region with knowledge and capital and innovation, qualified people. And then, inside the region, you need to connect people, networks, right? Why? Because, according to this theory, and this is true, innovation is a systemic event. I don't know if, and what all this means is that you don't just think about an idea and then go to a lab and then, play with technology and you have a product. No, you develop it. You talk to other people, you receive their ideas, firms interact with each other, so it's about a system. And then there's also, let's say, a political consequence from this. They say, well, okay, if you want the region to develop, you need to bring people together, and they need to think of a strategy together. And they all need to agree on it, and they have to behave coherently, right? So that as a region, you can all move in the same direction. So this is, and I know that this is a simplification, but this is, I think, a good characterization of how a lot of these models think about underdevelopment, right? And why regions are more or less developed. Now, I have 3 problems with this. Only 3 for now. 1, what if your resources are just not sufficient? I mean, it's not so easy to say the companies you have should be more productive. Maybe there's just not that capacity. Maybe you don't have the financial resources available to you. Maybe you've lost all your qualified people, all of the people who actually studied and had a good education left, all the skills. Maybe there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of displaced people, the immigrants, etc. What if your resources, and I don't mean insufficient in the sense that they're not good, of course, I just mean maybe there's just, it's not so easy to mobilize them. This, I think, is a very important point. What if institutions, and by institutions I mean, government, even you can think about universities, what if they do not want to improve? We assume that if you have a less developed region, all you have to do is give them a bit of help and they will start doing things better. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe someone is benefiting from the region being less developed. Maybe there's interests that are afraid of change. And so those interests might try to block change, even if everyone or almost everyone agrees that it would be for the better. And then it's my third point, which is really what I arrived at the last moment, which is, what if you do have innovation in firms, but you still do not have regional development? Okay? Your firms are innovating, they're doing all the things they are supposed to do, they're buying new technology, they're integrating it, but that still is not generating good results for the region. It's not growing, there's not more jobs, there's not better jobs. Now, I will start by asking a question just because to make sure we're all on the same page. What do we mean by innovation? I'm sure a lot of you have heard this word. If you read the newspaper, it's everywhere. Every politician will talk about innovation. I assume here in Greece it's the same. And usually when people think about innovation, they think about, I don't know, the new iPhone, right? But that's actually like a unique outlier, right? Most of the times, innovation is just people trying new things, changing small things. And now let me give you a few examples. Some of the companies, over the last few years, there's been a few companies that have emerged, and everyone said, oh, this is disruptive, this is the new wave of the future. A lot of them have been known as the sharing economy, right? And one thing that to me I found very interesting was that if you look at these companies, the technology that supports them, the technology is not that special. I mean, I'm not a computer programmer, so I wouldn't be able to do what Uber does. But it seems to me that crossing geolocation data with cars, it's not that complicated from a technical point of view. And yet they are dominant, and they are seen as disruptive, right? What do I think is actually the source of their success? It's not the idea, it's this, right? This is 2016, so 2 years ago. Already Uber was dominant. It was everywhere. They were losing $3 billion a year in this year. Okay? This is a lot of money. Can you imagine a small company in Greece thinking, I'm going to grow, and in 5 years I'm going to be losing $3 billion, and this will not be a problem? Right? Another example, Airbnb. I was talking to Kostis yesterday. He said that right now in Athens it's a big problem. In Lisbon also, where I'm originally, well, I grew up outside of Lisbon, it's also a big problem. There's a lot of, there's been a boom in tourism over the last few years, and it's getting harder and harder for local people to live there. This was 2015, right? The company is saying its annual revenue will grow. By 2020, will grow to 10 billion, and they expect to become profitable by then. So in 2020, they expect to start making money. Okay? And another example, Twitter. Twitter has actually been around for many years. I don't even know how it was created. But it's a similar thing. So again, 2017, they were saying, okay, we're going to cut staff and we hope to make a profit. Right? So what does this tell us about these companies? What really gave them success was not the idea, was the support they had, right? Similar things for Netflix. These companies were allowed to burn through a lot of cash, spend a lot of money, essentially achieve world domination almost, before they even had to think about making a profit. You can see similar things in medical sector, you can see similar things in biotechnology, you can see similar things in other areas. Which means that this already, I think, starts to make you think, all right, so actually being successful is not just about having great ideas and knowledge and innovation, no. You need something behind you that pushes you to this level, right? And then you start to think, okay, so underdevelopment or less development involves a few other issues. Now, when we talk about Portugal and Spain, there is innovation, but usually it's a little bit different. This is an example. This is from The Economist, a very famous international, well, based in Britain, very famous magazine. Okay? And this was from a couple of years ago. They said, shoes explain the real action of Portugal's austerity government. Why? Because one of the sectors in Portugal that really changed and became more innovative was the shoemaking sector. And in this article they said, right now in the world, Portuguese shoes are second to Italian shoes. So if you want high quality shoes, the first are still Italian, and then it's Portuguese shoes, right? I don't have any of these expensive Portuguese shoes, but apparently they're very famous in places like London and in Milan. Now, as some of you might know, even though the austerity government won, then the left wing came together, they formed a coalition. They are in power now, but it's true that after those 4 years of really difficult situations, the government still had a relative majority. And a lot of this stuff was based on innovation, not traditional innovation, but creating brands, new design, better products, etc. Now, Spain is a bit of a different animal compared to Portugal. And they do have some very good, like, maybe medium-tech industries like automobile. But a lot of it is based in Catalonia and the Basque Country. So Spain is a bit like Italy. You have the north, which is basically in terms of productivity and income and even unemployment, even during the crisis, when unemployment in Spain was 25%. If you went to the Basque Country, Catalonia, it was like 10%, for example. I mean, it's still very high, but it's, you know. So they do have these regions that are very wealthy, and it explains partly why Catalonia wants to become independent. They are 20% of Spanish GDP, just a small region with 7 million people. But still, there was this story, okay? And I know that what obviously from the, let's say, the European perspective, this was all about the structural package. They made them cut their salaries. But if you look at the actual reality, there was also a lot of technological innovation, a lot of new machines, a lot of investment in making your companies work better. All right, so I'm now going to start, let's say, departing from this, I'm going to start talking about these three elements. What if your resources are insufficient? What if your institutions do not want to change? What if you don't have regional development. The first side, the first part, is a bit more, I think, specific to my field, which is economic geography. It might be a bit too specific for some of you, but I think it's important to start there, and then we move on. All right? So this is the first point. There were a few years ago, as I'm sure a lot of you know, Southeast Asia, countries like first Japan, then South Korea, then Singapore, they were very poor after Second World War, and very quickly they moved and they became wealthy, right? And some people said, how do you explain this? They said, well, basically there were a few firms, usually protected by the government, in some way or another they were protected by the government. And they were able to first attract foreign technology, sometimes illegally. There is this thing, very interesting thing called reverse engineering. Have you ever heard of this? Okay. All right. It's when you buy a mobile phone, right? And you pull it apart, everything. You take everything apart. And then you start rebuilding it. And you learn how to build a mobile phone like that. That's why it's called reverse engineering. Rather than designing the parts, you buy one already made and you find how each component is made. And that's stealing, but okay. But that's how it happened, right? And they said, so these companies started by taking this new technology. So then first they learn how to use this foreign technology. Then they learn how to develop their own technology. And then they learn to innovate. They became very big firms. Like in South Korea, there is this thing called the chaebols, right? These are family-owned firms. They're like very close to the government, and they operate in anything for everything, Hyundai, Samsung, etc. Now, when you go to these places, the first thing you notice is that it's not that firms are not innovating, because they are innovating. More or less, you find, for example, in the sectors that I've studied in Portugal and a little bit in Spain also, you find very good qualified workers, right? If you go to a shoe factory, you find very good people who really know how to work, how to operate the machines and do very high quality products. But even in more complex things like electronics, toys, molds, they're very qualified people. But there is a little lack of, let's say, organizational capabilities. And this is a more unique thing. It's about how you make a firm work better as a whole, and how you manage to take the firm to a new level, right? And you have similar problems in universities in the public sector. I'm using these three because they are usually the three elements, right? Again, it's not that I've spent enough time in the UK and in Germany to tell you that not every professor in every British and German university is incredibly smart and creative. Okay? It's not. And there are very capable people in places like Spain and Portugal, and I'm sure here also, not just Costis and others also, right? But the universities as a whole often do not function well. I mean, it's very difficult. You want to do anything, and there's like this barrier in front of you, right? Another very important point, and this is something that is very difficult to measure, but it's true, is that as you go to less developed regions, you have a big difference between the best firms and the worst firms. Okay? And I know this is a very specific point, but I just want to make it now so that you can then have it in mind. So usually what happens is that if you go, let's say, to a top region in Germany, you have Volkswagen, which is very productive. Right? And then you have a bunch of other firms doing all sorts of things. In general, if you look at their performance, they're all very similar. What every firm you will work, you'll always be in a sort of productive firm. As you move to places like Portugal, Spain, you'll have some very good firms in shoemaking, in textiles, in toy manufacturing. But then a lot of the others will be very small, will not be very innovative, will not be very, they will have very much difficulty in incorporating technologies. So I saw this term in a paper by a very famous Norwegian scientist called Lundvall. And he distinguished between pioneer firms, so these are the ones at the edge, right? Maybe even developing new ideas. The first ones to adopt, and the last ones to adopt. And he said there's a big difference as you move to less developed regions and countries. Now, I don't know if you remember, but at the beginning I said one of these theories, what these theories say is regional innovation systems, and theories say that you have to bring people together and make them talk to each other so that they collaborate, right? Now, this is very difficult to do in less developed regions, in less developed countries. And so what do you have? You often have very good informal networks. Everyone knows everyone. a lot of these industries are very concentrated. For example, in Portugal, there's 2 regions, north and central, where a lot of them are. If you look at Spain, it's the same. But then when it comes to more formal networks, to actually collaborate, it's very difficult. Partly because of these differences, and partly because people don't trust each other. Right? You don't trust people, so you don't want to collaborate. You're afraid they might steal your ideas or your clients or whatever. The other point is this. Networks, they're not neutral. So when you connect with someone, think about when you create a group to work in school, right? I mean, sometimes it's the right, perfect group and you're all working together, but often that's not the case. There's one person who does a lot of work, there's one who's always trying to not do anything, and there's one who is very creative but doesn't actually write, and then there's one who actually does all the work, okay? So, this is sort of like a network. And networks of firms are not neutral. They exist for specific functions. If you have these environments where people aren't connecting to each other, it's very difficult to learn. It's very difficult to disseminate knowledge, and to disseminate especially that knowledge which is not easily transferable. Okay. This is maybe more specific and is not so important for the point I'm trying to make. All I'm trying to say is that in this context, it's very difficult to learn from the people around you because there's a lot of barriers for that to happen. Okay? Now we come to the second point, which is the point of institutions. Again here, if you go to more developed regions, often what they say is what matters is culture. Right? Culture, they often talk about an attitude, let's say, but people's attitude towards learning, towards knowledge, towards innovation. And they talk about things like trust. Yeah? People have to trust each other. And they talk about what you could call positive self-reinforcing mechanisms. What does this mean? Imagine you are in a context, you have a firm making tables, right? And around you there's 100 other firms making tables. And one day you go to your neighbor and say, let's collaborate, let's try to develop a technology, let's try to sell outside of the country. And it goes well, so you feel good. So the next time you do it again. And you do it again, and you create this environment where, it's almost like people collaborate, and it's, well, regarded, and it's normal, and it's a self-reinforcing mechanism, a virtuous circle. However, and this is a point that I think is very important, much less attention is paid to the importance of punishment, of coercion mechanisms. All right? If you go to the early sociological literature, they often said this. They said, in order to have an environment with trust, you need, it's true, these positive mechanisms, but you also need to know that if someone breaks the trust, you can easily punish them. This is very important. And this is often not discussed because in more advanced countries this is not a problem. But I know that this is the case in places like Portugal, in places like Spain, where the justice system, for example, is very slow, right? Where political connections are often very important, and where, therefore, if there is a problem in a breakdown, in a collaboration, you don't necessarily get a chance to get your resources back. Now, I don't know if you've seen this book recently. It's from 2012, I think. It was kind of like a bestseller. And it was a very interesting book because for many years economists, right, when they went to, let's say, to places like Africa or Latin America, for example, when there were problems and the IMF would intervene or they would ask for a loan from the World Bank, economists would say, well, all you have to do is, get your finances in order. Some of this might be familiar to you, right? Get your finances in order, privatize all your public state investments, and and let the economy work. And this will automatically generate economic growth. And for many years, economists would not talk of institutions. They said, this is not our role. We don't think about this thing. We don't think about the quality of government, about corruption, none of it. And recently, a few people started looking into this. And I think this is one of the best examples because they came up with a very simple idea. They said some countries have what they call inclusive institutions. Right? And all this means is that the institutions of the country, and they talk about things like property laws or education system, are designed to give resources to as many people as possible. So if you are a citizen of these countries, in theory, at least of course in theory, you have the similar amount of rights and protections as everyone else. Other countries have what they call extractive institutions, right? These institutions are designed to take resources from the country to the hands of a small group of people, of elites. They make this interesting point, of course, because they're economists, they have to think about statistical inference, blah, blah. So they go to colonial times and they look at countries that were very similar, for example, North America and South America, but for small differences. And in some cases, very big differences, like the existence of slavery or how slavery was regulated, etc. They say we can actually show that these small variations had an impact in the institutions of these countries and explains why some are rich and other countries, like countries of Latin America, which actually have a lot of potential, they have a lot of natural wealth, just they cannot break from that cycle of a few people absorbing most of the wealth of the country. I know this is a simplistic argument, but it's a very useful one. They make another very important argument, and I think here really this is the thing that to me was more revealing. They say, well, actually two. One, they say when you talk about institutions like the way you manage the economy, like the way you manage the labor market, like the way you manage universities, these institutions result from political processes, from power, asymmetries, from power, from struggles, from conflict, right? And it's this political process that determines which institutions a country has. One. Second, very important, there is no reason why a country with bad institutions will automatically become better. They say this, there's no reason for this. Why? Because in a country with bad institutions, and this is my simplification, someone is making a lot of money out of those bad institutions, right? This is the idea of the extractive institutions. And I want to show you, Francis Fukuyama became very famous in the 90s. He wrote this book called The Hand of History. He was like a triumphalist. He was saying, okay, from now on the United States will rule the world. And then people said we were wrong, but he actually wrote a very good book recently. That's why I put it there, on the origins of political harmony. But I wanted to show you this, okay? These are the largest companies in Spain. This was taken from Forbes, and I actually think this date is from 2015. If you look at the companies, you see banks. I see a lot of banks and insurance. This is all banks. You see energy, like Iberdrola, like gas natural. So this is electricity. This is natural gas. You see things like infrastructure, right? I don't know if you've ever been to Spain, traveling. The road system is incredible, right? You travel for hours, you don't see any cars hardly. Very good roads. It explains why Spain has the highest number of motorways per inhabitant in the world. I saw a table a while ago. Spain has something like 12 miles of motorway for every 1,000 inhabitants. The second country is Portugal. Something like 11 miles. But the third country is Sweden with 6 miles. So it's double, right? It's incredible. Another thing, you go to Spain, you take a high-speed train. It's amazing. It's expensive, but it's amazing. But they're empty, apart from a few ones, right? So why does this connect with the previous point that I was making? Extractive institutions doesn't necessarily mean corruption, okay? But it does mean that in a country, you have, of course, the government, and you have a few core companies, very important companies, that operate according to specific logics. And if you operate in the financial sector, in the energy sector, in the construction sector, how do you make money? You make money by limiting competition and by rent seeking. And by the way, this is not some, I know that this is the radical geography seminar, but for example, The Economist, which is a very mainstream magazine, they have a rent-seeking index, right? They try to measure countries by how important rent-seeking is. And they have banking, construction in their index. So what they say is, if you have a lot of banking and construction in your country, you are probably a country where rent-seeking is very important. Things like managing motorways. I mean, the contracts that the governments wrote with these companies were ridiculous, right? You go up, and then there's Inditex, of course, which is Zara, but that's, well, Zara is not the companies, but that's one of the few that actually sells what you would call tradable goods. So things where you actually produce them and you can sell them in the market elsewhere. A lot of the rest is non-tradable goods, particularly finance, energy, and construction. Now you go to Portugal. By the way, this is taken from Wikipedia, but I actually checked the data. It's good, it's just that it was the only place where I could find it, you know, like this, organized so well. Anyway. Now here you do have a few different things. You have food and beverages and a lot of retail, but you also have a lot of energy and a few banks. Where are they? Okay. Here. The interesting thing about Portugal is that there was a revolution in 1974, which didn't happen, for example, in Spain. And at that time, a lot of the big companies were privatized. Were nationalized, right? And they came to the hands of the state, and they received monopolies for a while, but then they were given back to the private sector. And one of the many interesting things, and there was a few historians who did this a while ago, they found out that there's a small number of families, maybe like, you know, between less than 10 families, that have been in control of the most important resources in the country since the 19th century. The 19th century. So the country was a monarchy, they were in power. Then the country was a republic, they stayed in power. Then it was a military dictatorship, and then a civil dictatorship, they were in power. Then there was a small period when it was all nationalized, and then when it was privatized, it was given back to the same family. Now, even in areas like retail, there is also it's also difficult to have a lot of competition because you know, if you get a permit to open a big shopping center, nobody else can open it, right? I mean, you receive. So even in areas like retail, like media, a lot of these sectors have been restricted. So if you look at this, you might think, oh, it's a bit more competitive sectors comparison to Spain, but the reality is you have a similar system, which is the government allied itself with a few companies, and it allowed these companies to grow a lot, but then these companies do not have positive effects for the rest of the economy. This is the point I was trying to make. Because that's not their goal, right? Rent seeking is not about developing value chains, it's not about investing in innovation, it's about making sure that you continue to get the same benefits as before. And just as an example, let's look at Germany. The biggest companies, Volkswagen, Daimler, okay, there's an insurance there, but BMW, Siemens, Bosch, right? BASF, Bayer. These are all companies that are in fact operating in world markets. They're very competitive, and they are selling tradable goods. Now, they have protection from the German government, it's true, but so does Toyota, and so does Ford, and so does, okay? So they, even if they have special relationship with the government, they operate in markets where they have to invest in innovation, and they have to invest in their workers, and they have to invest in their value chains. And I'm not saying that it's a perfect world, because I've been to Germany, and if you talk to the suppliers of even in Germany, if you talk to the people who are supplying the big companies, they will say, oh yes, they squeeze us out of our profits, and they're very mean, but the reality is that you have, aside from these big companies, you have what they call the Mittelstand, yeah? You have this number of middle-sized companies in Germany which are very good, very productive, they pay good salaries, they're very competitive. The point I was trying to make before is that when we start to think about these formal institutions, right, and the way they influence development, we start to look at the relationship between the government, a few core firms, and the impact that has on the rest of the economy. A lot of the sectors that I'm interested in Portugal and Spain, like I said, shoemaking, textiles, etc., electronics, are outside of these core areas of activity. And the reality is that, and I know the Portuguese context a bit better, to a certain extent they developed in spite of the government, not with the help of the government. Right? Oh, okay, I'm sorry, let me clarify that because I have to make it clear. For example, in the 1990s, there is a company that was one of the first luxury shoes from Portugal called Fly London. And the guy was talking to the Prime Minister, the owner was talking to the Prime Minister. He said, oh, I'm going to create this new brand, it's going to be very good. And the Prime Minister said, you know, shoemaking, that's traditional, that's old thing. You should get rid of that and go to high-tech and computers, right? And the guy didn't do it, and it's fortunate because shoemaking still employs a lot of people. Now, what the government did do for these companies, and I will show you this in a second, is keep salaries down. So minimum wage in Portugal is still very low. It was always very low. It's nowadays it's like 550 euros, but this is already a big step from, you know, even 10 years ago it was like 400 euros. Okay? And I tell you right now that Portugal is not that cheap a country to live in. So that has been the help that the government has given these companies. But in terms of other investments, in terms of helping them, you know, internationalize or develop, right, it has been very limited. I just want to make a very small point, which is, okay, this is national scale. I do think that the regional scale also is important, because there is this concept in law, this is not even from economic geography, where they talk about de jure and de facto institutions. Is anyone here from law? Oh, so I hope I'm not making a mistake when I say it. And what they mean here is that you know, de jure is basically what is in the text of the law. You're right. You cannot steal, right? De facto is what actually happens. You cannot steal, but sometimes it's okay, right? So, and so when people talk about institutions, they often talk about this difference. And I think this is important, in some countries more than in others. So Portugal is a fairly small, homogeneous country. Lisbon is a wealthiest region, but it's also a region that is very much international. Nowadays, it's become very famous for celebrities. I don't know why. Well, I know why. It's very beautiful, but it was very recent. And so last year, Madonna bought a house in Lisbon, and it was a big deal. It's also a house that has a very famous novel from a Portuguese writer called Miguel. It's from the 19th century. It's one of the most important novels. And the palace in that novel is the house that she bought. I don't know if you know. And it's on the news every day. But nowadays, there's a lot of actors like Scarlett Johansson and I don't know who else. They're buying apartments in Lisbon. It became very famous. So it's that. But for example, in Spain, this difference I think is a bit more important, because you do have some regions that are almost at the level of Northern Europe, and then you have others where really it's very difficult to change the productive structure or the politics. I mean, you have places like, I work in Valencia, but I live in Murcia. The PP, the center-right, has been in power for I don't know how many years. It doesn't matter what they do almost. You know, the economy can be collapsing, they're still in power, so there's very complicated networks of informal family and personal favors, and etc. And so in this, you cannot really solve by changing laws, right? It's a bit complicated, because of course, I'm sure that in Spanish laws it says it's illegal to give jobs to your friend, but people still do it, right? So I think this is a very interesting point, especially in countries like Spain, like Italy, where there's a big difference. And I do ask myself these questions, you know, why does bad governance persist? If you think about the European Union, right, we have places like Spain, Greece joined in 81, right, is that correct? 81, Spain and Portugal 86. It's been now almost 3 decades, and there's still certain institutional aspects that remain and that don't change, and I find this very curious. Why? You are in Portugal, you go to a cafe, and you ask for a job, and they say, we will pay you minimum wage, and you will work 12 hours a day, and you don't complain, right? You get on an airplane, you live in London, 2 hours later. You get into a cafe, they say, we will pay you £1,000 a month, you will work 8 hours a day, and that's it. At least that's my experience. And I do question, why is there not more convergence at this level? Anyway, so now we arrive at the third point, which is really what I wanted to get, which is that innovation at the firm level is not sufficient. And this goes back to this theory. So you do have innovation in these regions. You have a lot of it in very traditional sectors. My hypothesis at this moment is that partly this happens because of what I call the productivity gap. So you have some firms that are very innovative, but then you have a lot of others which are not very innovative. And then there's this thing which I think is probably the most important one, right? If you have a firm, a company, and you make tables, and you buy a new technology, what's your objective? Your objective is to make twice as many tables by employing the same number of people, or even less people, right? You want to become more productive, have higher profits, and pay less salaries. So what happens if you have a sector like shoemaking, right? And it invests in technology, it becomes more productive. It's producing more, but it's employing less people. What happens to the labor surplus? There was a paper, a very interesting paper from 2015, where these economists looked at Latin America and Southeast Asia. Right? Southeast Asia, South Korea, Singapore, etc. And they said that they identified in both these blocks of countries, they identified the most important sectors. And they found this very interesting thing. Economists, sometimes they simplify things too much, but this can also help you to really see the big picture. They said, if you look at these two blocks of countries, the most important sectors became more productive in both places. So, if you go to places like Brazil, for example, they have a very good automotive sector. It's competitive, it's international, right? Similar thing for East Asia. The difference is that in Southeast Asia, the people that were released this labor surplus went into other sectors which were equally productive or even more productive. So the economy as a whole became better. In South America, this labor surplus moved into the informal economy or unemployment, or less productive sectors like retail. So even though you have some firms that became better, more innovative, the result for the whole economy was worse performance. Right? And they say that this explains a lot of the divergence between Latin America and Southeast Asia. And I believe, and we have some data, it's not as extensive as it should be, we have some data showing that this also happens in European regions. Now, we had a big experiment a few years ago, which was the crisis. The crisis generated a lot of labor surplus. What happened to this labor surplus? I'm sure in Greece it's similar. Well, if I go to Spain or Portugal, the people who still have a job, they're okay, but the people who lost their job are in temporary employment, are unemployed, or they went to Germany and to the UK. Right? So, of course, in this case, it was not because of innovation, it was because of other things, but you do have this situation where particularly less developed regions, if they have a shock and you have people that are no longer employed in the main industries, they move into less productive industries, or they go wrong. All right, so let me just show you some data before I finish. So this was just, this is data from Eurostat, and I was just trying to find the most important sectors in Portugal and Spain in terms of employment, right? Some of these things you would expect, this and this will be tourism. Some of these things I didn't expect, like land transportation. I have no idea what, but I mean, it's just it's trucks and stuff like that. But then you have, this will be shoemaking, and this will be textiles, for example, right? And I just decided to look at these industries. Indeed, I will not look at all of them, it will be too much. I wanted to do this, but then it would be too complicated, so I just did that. I also want you to know that, of course, these are absolute numbers, right? You have to think Portugal has 10 million people. I think it's a bit like Greece. So this is actually quite a lot of people, right? This is national data because there's not good regional data, but I will then show you that most of these industries are located. So, now this is, 2008, 2015, because these are very different things, I'm not using absolute values, I'm using change, right? So this is, I'm using 2008 as the base, 0 to 0, and then just how much change accumulated. And I use 4 different things, which is total number of employees, productivity, wages and salaries, and share of personnel costs. This is very important. So, out of your total cost of production, how much of that is to pay your personnel? And this is what you see. Textiles, productivity increased significantly, right? Wages, less so. Now, just recently, actually, I was in Portugal talking to some people who work on this area, and they said, So for sure, one of probably the most important reason why the minimum salary is so low in Portugal is because of these people, right? They say if you increase even by 5 euros, we will be out of work. And if you look at the collective agreement for workers in textiles, it's like this. If you are a starting salary, you make 550 euros minimum, right? If you are a supervisor, you make 551 euros. If you are a manager, you make 560 euros. Like it's really is, you know, they keep it very tight. But it's true that the minimum wage has increased a little bit during this time. But this is the more important thing. Overall, the share of personnel costs has decreased. So, the point I'm trying to make with this is that now productivity can be increasing for a lot of reasons, but in general, you see some innovation, right? Firms are becoming more productive. But less of that money is going to people, to personnel. And there's a decrease in total number of employees, even if wages have grown a little bit. You can look at shoemaking. The example that the economists gave, similar point, productivity increased even more. It's great, right? Some of this productivity is because of innovation. Wages also increased a little bit, and actually employees increased quite a lot. So this is good. But again, less of this money is going to people, to personnel. So this is the first example. You have innovation, but this doesn't necessarily mean regional development. Why? Because the benefits of innovation are not being distributed equally. Most of these sectors are in the north and central of Portugal. They have been and continue to be the poorest regions in Portugal. North, central, right? But this is, I'm sorry, this is measured in terms of the percentage of the EU average. So Lisbon in 2000 was 120% of EU GDP. It's actually been going down, especially with the crisis. But regions like Norte and Central only have GDP which is less than 70% of the EU average. Despite having this in industries, despite what the economists said, they are saving the country, and all this productivity, you haven't really seen an impact at the regional level. Now let's go to Spain. I don't want to bother you with the details. I will say that Spain has even more what you would call non-tradable, so there's a lot of services in the major employment, but also tourism is even bigger in Spain. I mean, in the 90s, I don't know now, but they received like almost 10% of the world's tourists were going to Spain. So they have a lot of, but they do have some things like manufacturing food products, and they also have fabricated metals. So I decided to choose two sectors to look at. One was computer programming, just because it is one of these new sectors, and it is tradable. And the other was actually automobile, which is not here, but it's also very important. You will notice that if you look at so productivity, the values are closer to Europe in some of the sectors, but they're still generally lower. So the same sectors in Spain are less productive than the same sectors in Europe as well. Motor vehicles, same thing, productivity increased. Employees, unfortunately decreased. Wages and salaries stayed stable. Share of personnel costs went down. Okay, so again, firms have become more innovative. They're producing more. Less money is going to be to the employees, right? And here, actually, it's a bit more. Productivity stayed stable, but still, personnel costs decreased. I know that this was a very unique period in this country's history, right? This was a period of crisis, and it was a period where the economic policy was specifically designed to make labor less expensive, right? So you would always expect to see this value falling. But it's interesting that it's happening at the same time that the countries are also becoming more productive. Right? So if productivity had stayed the same and the share of personnel costs had fallen, I would have said, okay, it was just the policy. That was what they were trying to do. But you actually see the firms becoming more productive, more innovative, and still personnel costs were falling. Because Spain has a lot of regions, I couldn't take all of them, so I used Valencia because it's where I live, but also because they have a lot of these industries are located there. Electronics, toys, ceramics, shoemaking, textile. It's a very strong region in terms of this industry, and yet GDP growth stable, declining. A lot of it in line with Spain, but actually it's been diverging from Spain. So even though Spain also had a crisis, of course, Valencia slightly became bigger if you look at the beginning of the time. The region that did really well was the Basque Country in Catalonia, and this is true if you put all the Spanish regions. The Basque Country in Catalonia, though, have one thing, which is they have a lot of headquarters, they have a lot of companies, big multinationals that are located there. I will just go back to this last point, which is because this is something that Costas has asked me to reflect on, which is what have we learned, right, from the crisis? And when I saw that question, I had a few questions myself, which is, first of all, who's we? And I don't know, I cannot speak for all Portuguese people or for all Spanish people. I can speak a little bit for academics, which is where I was located, right? And a little bit for policymakers. And I would say we haven't learned a lot, actually. We haven't learned a lot. Partly because, how can we learn? I mean, how do you learn in general, right? You need time, you need resources, you need to think, you need to experiment. There's no, in a period of crisis, there's no space for that. Universities have been decimated, they've lost a lot of jobs. There's a lot of people, I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with this, who want to get a job in university, but they spend years and years on contracts, they have to teach a lot just to have a salary. There's no space to learn. So one thing I see is we are still basically importing ideas from other countries, using our data and then sending it back. For example, my center is dedicated to the study of innovation. We have a lot of people doing research on university-industry relationships. In Spain, this is not important. For the development of the economy, it is not central at all. Why do we do this? Because it's the models that come from abroad. There's a lot of people doing research on bibliometrics, measuring how many people publish, how many are cited, this kind of analysis. And some of them are doing interesting research. By the way, they're very good people, they're my colleagues, I like them very much, but I think part of the problem is we keep not having space to actually try to learn and try to teach something also. I think we really have to make an effort to look at our reality and try to say, okay, what can this actually teach us? Because I've, over the last few months, or years actually, I've been doing some work with the European Union. I mean, obviously not directly, but analyzing this thing called smart specialization strategies. I don't know if you've heard about it. And I've recently just written a report on implementation. And the problem, even though there was a lot of goodwill behind it, the problem is the same as before. Rich regions are doing very well, even rich regions in Spain. They have research institutes, they have good companies, they have qualified people, they have money, they have finance. They're doing very well, yeah. They use this as a way to think about how to invest strategically. Poor regions have no idea what they're going to do, right? Because they have no resources. They've lost a lot of qualified people to the core regions and to the core countries of Europe. The public sector is working on the edges. There's no people to do anything. Everyone is working on a very tight schedule and budget. And so I think we haven't learned a lot, I would have to say. Unfortunately. Maybe because we haven't had a lot of time to think, or resources at the time. And I would like, now, especially now that I'm in Spain, I keep thinking about this. I think we need to think together, right? I mean, we in Southern Europe, we have to start thinking together. We have to stop looking so much towards, core and start looking more towards each other, and try to build coalitions and help to influence the debates internationally. But it's not easy.